All right, hey everyone. So I was working on the Percona Grow cluster. So we've added the Grow um, API calls here, and we validate that the context is or the cluster is good, and we we end up creating the new instances and building that new cluster out. So after adding the new API and stuff, and added some int test here. So we have the red stack int test group PXC, and this group runs all of the integration test around PXC. So running through, we create a normal instance here, and with the validation, and we do a couple test instances like get the status, volume, checking the volume that's there, and then we restart, resize, basically all this stuff as a single instance. Um, then we then we create then we down here we create have some tests to create the cluster with fewer instances, basically making sure that we validate that you have to at least have two instances in this case for our test, and we validate that there's an error that comes back for too few, if the flavors are different or the volumes are different. And then we have a successful create cluster, which is a normal one. In this case, it's a two clustered instance. We wait for that to come active, and then we test the cluster communication. What we're doing here is we're actually creating a database on one node, and we expect it to replicate to all the other nodes. Then what I've added now is the test cluster grow. So this test cluster grow actually calls the new API that I've added with one new instance, and it's going to be using the same flavor and volume size as the rest of them. And we wait for that to become active, and um, then we test that the cluster has the existing database that we created in this cluster communication. So we validate that that existing database exists, and then we do another cluster communication where we actually create a new database in there and validate that that new database is replicated across all of the instances. Um, so that we have a valid cluster at that point, and then we go ahead and tear down that cluster, and we see that all these tests actually passed, which is awesome. Woohoo! So then I manual to show you what manually happens here for this, we have a Trove cluster create of the test PXC is the name of the cluster that I'm creating, of the PXC data store 5.5 version, and then we have one instance of flavor 7 volume 1, and then another one of the exact same. Um, so then this is the output that comes back. I really hate this output, and so I've actually logged a bug on this. You can see it's really verbose. The main thing, the problem here is the instances that we have. We kind of need to clean this up, and it should show the same thing that even you see the task here and task description and stuff. So we really need to, this really needs to be the same as this cluster show. Should show something very similar to this, so it's not so uh, verbose. And actually added a bug here in the public to say, hey, we need to clean the cluster create up. So we'll end up working on that eventually here. So we see the cluster show is in building, and we have the two IP addresses from the building initial cluster. Then we end up having the cluster show, and we see that it's completed, and we have the two IP addresses. And then if we look at the cluster instances, which shows the list of instances in this cluster, we see the two instances and they're active. And then let's grow the cluster. So then we do a Trove cluster grow, the name of the cluster or the ID that can be there, and then we add a dash dash instance of the flavor equals 7, volume equals 1, which this was the same as what we have previously. So we're basically just adding one new instance to that, and this new instance then is in a build state. Um, and we wait for that, or we can look at the cluster show, and we see that the new or that existing cluster is now in a different task state, where we have is a cluster growing cluster, where we're increasing the size of the cluster by 1 there. Then once we have the cluster show again later after it's completed, we see that it's changed to none, and we also see the new IP address there for that new instance. We can see from the cluster list or the cluster instances list, we have this new instance, and now it is active as well. We can see the Nova list here. We see all of the IP addresses as well for each one of the clusters. So then we can go from there. We can actually then log into one of these instances, and let's say we go into the first one here, and I'll get a command that we can look at the status of this actual MySQL cluster from this single instance perspective. So once we're in here, we need to do MySQL, actually just MySQL. So MySQL, and then once we're in there, now we can see the status of the WSRep call, which gives us all the information about the replication for the cluster, as well as the cluster information. And so we can see that the cluster size is 3, and and we see that it's connected, and we see that everything is synced up. We can also see that it's received some bytes, so it's the cluster communication has been working. We can also look at a few more variables here, where we see if you notice here, we have an incoming address of the 1003 and a 2 and a 4. This is all the IP addresses of each one of the instances, but the cluster rep address here, or WS rep cluster address here, just shows 2 of the IP addresses, so it doesn't have that 4th one. You may wonder why. This is because the first 2 instances in the cluster we didn't have to restart. The new instances, as we're growing the cluster, actually connect to one of the instances that's already running. So this new instance will connect to the cluster, decide, and then all the other instances automatically get registered within that cluster so that they all see each other. So this cluster address that you see here, this is actually from the configuration. So that configuration we have, we initially only had 2 instances in this cluster, so we only see 2. And you also see the name there. If we cat the etc MySQL conf d50 system to cluster conf, this is the cluster configuration that we inject to define what the cluster looks like. If we look in this file, we actually see all 3 of the nodes in this cluster, right? Instead of just the 2 that we have there for that GCOM address. So we didn't actually restart any of the original instances in the cluster because they don't need to be restarted. But in the future, if you ever needed to restart this, maybe you need to rebuild the cluster, or maybe need to restart this MySQL service for whatever reason, it will automatically have this, because we did actually update this configuration file to have the latest all the instances in the configuration. That's one of the kind of post processing on the growing the cluster. So we update this configuration, but we don't actually restart the original nodes. But all of the configurations across all 3 of the nodes have this same configuration. Let's look at another one of them. So let's look at this one on 2, and we go into MySQL here, and then we can let's look at the status here. So we also see on this node, we also see all 3 of the nodes there, and we see the cluster size just as we saw on the other one. With this, we see as well just the two addresses here. very similar to what I showed for um, the first one there. And but you see all three instance IPs are in this list. What this actually does here is whenever the instance starts up, it allows any of the IP addresses in this list to kind of be the discoverable instances of the cluster. So this helps um, the new node joining the cluster, or if even on restart, know what instances or what IP addresses it needs to go find um, the cluster, the rest of the cluster instances on. So if we we looked at 2 and 3, or 2 and 4, let's look at 3 here and see if we see any difference here. Um, so we see 3 nodes as well on this one, and then if we look on here, we see the 2 nodes as well. This is because these are originally the 2, right? So if we cat the MySQL confd 52 cluster, all right, then we see all the nodes again, and all the this WS rep SST auth. This is the replication user and password that it uses for the extra backup tool. So this is one of the things that we had to do was actually pull this information out of the original cluster and actually apply this to the new cluster so that we didn't have to go change the passwords on everything, as well as knowing what that cluster name is, and I think that was it. I think all we needed to know is the name and the auth stuff here. So that's kind of it. We have a new cluster, and then we can, and we've got some tests there that actually validate it. So thanks. Questions? Just kidding, no questions.